This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. You can join our conversation about the week's news at WNPR.org/The Wheelhouse. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. Joining us, as always, is Colin McEnroe. He's the host of The Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. Howdy, Colin.
Good morning, Mr. Dankosky.
Also with us is Keith Fanoff. He's the state budget reporter, the state budget guru from the Connecticut Mirror. Hello there, Keith.
Nice to be here.
And Harriet Jones, managing editor for Connecticut Public Radio. Hello there, Harriet.
Good morning, John.
Well, we're going to start with something that Keith just loves to talk about, fiscal doom and gloom, some more bad economic news for the state. But I suppose we should start, Colin, with maybe the guy who's in charge of turning around our economic future. His name is David Lehman. He's been tapped by Ned Lamont to be the new head of DECD, not as yet confirmed. We've been spending some time talking about him and his candidacy for that position over the course of the last couple of weeks. You've been writing about it in your Hearst column. You hadn't got a chance to sit down and really talk with the guy yet. I guess I'm just wondering if you can give us a little sense of what you learned about David Lehman, former Goldman Sachs executive, a guy who was pulled in front of Congress to talk about the financial meltdown. What you've learned about him in the last couple hours.
Right. So I met with him last evening. I'll start with the good news. I think the good news, there's been a question all along about how his experience at Goldman Sachs would map onto his role in the public sector. I mean, are there ways in which his experience there would have any relevance here? And I think he did a very good job of explaining and kind of convincing me that, yes, over the last 10 years, his work has involved a lot of dealings with the public sector, even in one case, a deal involving UConn, also University of Texas, so some of the public universities, but also state of California. They've had clients who are public sector clients. He's been heavily involved in raising capital and arranging financing for deals. And so to whatever extent economic development works that way, and in particular, he's very interested in what are called opportunity zones. This is a fairly new piece of federal legislation. We have 72 opportunity zones in Connecticut. These are basically zones that have been, or areas that have been designated as, I don't know, sort of needing economic development and maybe not having a good traditional path to it. And the nice thing about it is that the so the Malloy administration was very reliant on state tax breaks, which, as Keith will explain, depleted the exchequer quite a bit. Here, the federal government is footing the bill. These are all deferrals, basically, of federal taxes. So, I mean, if you could do it, and if you could do it right and you can make that work, you can maybe have some kinds of economic development we've had in the past. He's got a lot to learn. I was sort of trying to talk through the use of quasi-publics under John Rowland to see if he had kind of a handle or an opinion about that. He admitted that he didn't know as much about stuff like that as maybe he will eventually. So I think that's good news. I was very concerned about whether or not he really had discernible qualifications for this job. I'm more convinced that he does. Now, there's some other oddities that remain, including I started by asking him who he voted for in the 2018 election. He said he wasn't going to tell me. It kind of suggests to me that he didn't vote for Ned Lamont, or he would have said so. But still, he resigned from Goldman Sachs on February 13th, sold his stock because he's so inspired by Ned Lamont and Ned Lamont's vision that he feels like the best thing that he can do with his life right now is to try to make a positive difference in the Lamont administration. I don't know, I have a little trouble. Like there's this the timeline doesn't really work that well for me. He is not remorseful about things that happened in 2000 and 2008, ways in which Goldman Sachs played both sides, had tremendous conflicts of interest, particularly developing these massive investment instruments, luring investors to come and take positive positions, make positive investments in those instruments, while Goldman Sachs was taking massive short positions. And as I said to him, ethically, I don't think you could persuade a 12-year-old kid that was an okay thing to do. So I don't know. I mean, I asked him if he had any heroes in public service, any presidents, or since he's entering the world of public service. And his only heroes of public service were other Goldman Sachs people who had people like Hank Paulson and Robert Rubin and Gary Cohn who left Goldman Sachs to go into public service. I pressed him a little bit more on this, and he just really couldn't come up with anything. I feel like, and I'll stop after this, but, I think he might be a pretty good technocrat. That's what he is, though. He's going to be a technocrat. And it worries me as people come into public service that they don't have any philosophical underpinning or a way in which they can consult with something, with a philosophical position or a theological position and say, well, that's not right. I'm not going to do that because... And I have a little bit of a concern. I couldn't get anything like that out of him.
Keith, I mean, you've met with a guy. I mean, what are your thoughts, your concerns, your feelings?
I have not met one-on-one with him yet, and I always get leery when I start the show saying I completely agree with Colin entirely, but I do. And this, I can't emphasize this enough. Economic Development Commissioner in Connecticut in this day and age is a particularly controversial job because it largely comes down to picking winners and losers. Everyone says, well, wait, that's not what Governor Lamont wants. Didn't you see what he did with the sales tax? We're getting rid of exemptions. Fine. Easy to say. But when you're governor and somebody like Pratt & Whitney says, I'm thinking of moving X thousand jobs out of the state, the history is you blink and you get out the checkbook and you say, what can we do for you? That makes the Economic Development Commissioner a very, very dicey job in Connecticut because you're going to be seen as the person the up front who's picking the winners and losers. And I mean, Lehman is going to have a checkered past to begin with. And if because he is, as Colin said, unremorseful about certain things, it could make it a very rough transition this first time. And somebody will, just as sure as we're Connecticut, come forward and say, Governor Lamont, we're really thinking of leaving the state or moving some jobs. This could make it a challenging person to sell that why we should invest in Company X or Company Y.
Yeah, Colin, I'm really very interested to hear that you do think he has the background, because that was my biggest question about him. And of course, there are the ethical considerations of what he did during the 2008 crisis. But, what has he done since that qualifies him for this job? I thought that was one of the biggest questions out there. And it's interesting to hear that you think he has skills because, of course, Wall Street is not Main Street, to borrow a phrase. And whatever you know about credit default swaps doesn't really prepare you for the world of, do you loan to a hairdresser or a coffee shop, or do you loan taxpayer money? What do you know about redeveloping brownfields? I mean, you have some real bread and butter Main Street issues to deal with as DECD commissioner. And does he have those skills? And it's interesting to hear you think he will be a technocrat.
Although some of the things you raised right there might be things that he's going to have a learning curve for. I did bring this up. One of my little hobby horses or something. I feel as though one of the mistakes that gets made in government-driven economic development is they think the savior is coming from someplace else. So
Yes.
I can use Front Street as a good example. Adrian's Landing, about $1 billion in public monies went into Adrian's Landing. If you add up everything, state, federal, everything, about $1 billion. So what did they want to do? Well, their idea of economic development was to get like the Hard Rock Cafe or something to come in there, right? That's what they thought was great. Whereas I said this to Lehman last night. I said, we have or had, depending on who you believe, an Italian-American restaurant district over on Franklin Avenue that's been struggling, and some of the old restaurants have closed. And nobody thought about that. Nobody thought about, we have indigenous businesses here, to your point about the hairdresser or the what. Let's bring things we're already proud of and that we care about into this already heavily publicized entertainment district. And he at least, I wasn't really asking him a question when I talked about this, but he at least got what I was talking about.
But that's also, when Colin uses the Adrian's Landing in Hartford example, Harriet, that's also tied up in John Rowland era massive civic corruption, the idea of who gets contracts to pour the concrete, with the idea that hopefully that world has passed us by. There is a new type of economic development that needs to come to cities and towns. And to Keith's point, sometimes it is about picking winners and losers. It's not always about giving money to the hairdresser, but it is about sort of identifying something inherently interesting or good about a place and making it someplace that's worthwhile to live and spend money, both for the people who live there, but also other people from the outside who could come there to spend money.
Well, and also, just thinking about the kind of the higher profile stuff that the DECD has done in recent years with First Five, or however many ended up being First 15 or something. There were the Pratt & Whitneys, which are, in and of themselves indigenous companies which might remain here. But there were also, really controversial deals to lure companies here who don't necessarily have any kind of, loyalty or to the state or any roots here. And are those good deals to do? Are those things that we should be spending taxpayer money on? Might be interesting to see under this new Lehman regime whether that's something that continues.
Well, I do want to say one more quick thing, which is he, like Ned Lamont, he doesn't really know how to work in government, all right? Neither one of these people has ever really worked in government. He's going to have a lot of learning to do there. The way that you put together a deal for Goldman Sachs and the way you put together a deal within under the umbrella of a state government are two different things. He will have a lot of learning to do. But I think that's very characteristic of quite a few people in the Lamont administration.
I want to pivot then with that note to go to where we are economically in the state right now, Keith. We've been getting some bad economic news, mixtures of good economic news in Connecticut over the course of the last year. But just recently we've seen both jobs numbers downwardly revised, and also Kevin Lembo, the state comptroller, coming out and saying this April when the tax receipts come in, we might not get another bonanza like we have in the past. What are you seeing here, Keith?
I think the technical term is things are getting squishy.
Squishy, okay.
Squishy.
So squishy sounds not so bad.
Well, here's what happened if you, and I realize now I'm doing a sight gag on radio, but if you just picture a staircase going down, each step going down, that's sort of what our job growth has been since the last recession. You start out and you've regained jobs, and then each year the growth is a little less and a little less, and that's how you get that staircase effect. When you get to the bottom of the staircase, you get nervous because then you start using the R word, and that's recession. People got nervous because this jobs report came out, the jobs reports had been coming out in 2018. It's like, we're going to break the pattern. We're not going to get to the bottom of the staircase. And then we get the correction this week and we're told, we didn't gain 20,000 jobs last year. We only gained 10,000. The staircase continues. And that's coupled with what you mentioned. Kevin Lembo said, if you take a look at how the income tax receipts came in New York in December and January on the capital gains side, they were kind of soft. We had a little bit of softness in our December numbers in capital gains and dividends, but nobody paid attention because we thought the withholding was going up until we just got the bad job news. And all of a sudden, we're clinging to find something that's saying this recovery is still going. It does not mean we're going into recession tomorrow. But all the stars keep lining up that make people wonder, are we beginning that 15-month countdown to a recession? Usually when enough of these fall into place, and the big test will be April, the numbers get softer.
How much is all of this related to the tax changes at the federal level, just sort of not understanding the tax framework and within which we're living right now?
Right. Not being an economist, I don't want to completely dismiss that, but I think I've always been taught the forces are even much bigger than the president of the United States, and I'm not standing up necessarily for the Republican tax changes that took effect in 2018. I think that makes it a little bit harder for Connecticut. We traditionally have always been the last state to go into a recession. We may not necessarily be the last one this time.
Yeah. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what does happen in April when the state finally finds out where 2018 falls in terms of tax receipts, because a lot of things happened in 2017 which made us very hopeful, but they may have been one-time things. So a lot of people kind of gamed the system when they realized these tax changes were coming down the pike for 2018 and may have done creative things with their income in 2017, which improved the state's tax receipts at that point. Also, we had this one-time gain from hedge fund managers who may have offshored funds. They had this one chance to bring them back, and that also bolstered tax receipts last April. So those one-time things kind of made us fairly hopeful last April. They may not recur again this April.
Being hopeful about one-time things actually isn't understanding necessarily what one-time things means.
Absolutely. I think the other point I'd make about the jobs numbers is there's some interesting things within those jobs numbers which are not on the surface of that data. One of which is that there are thousands and thousands of open positions in Connecticut. It's not the case that employers are not creating jobs. It's the case that we have a skills gap. And, they can't find qualified people to fill those jobs. So, and another thing about, the household survey that gives us the unemployment number is that people sometimes report themselves as not looking for work. They may not necessarily be working, but they're not counted in those unemployment numbers. So there's a lot of other things going on amongst that data.
And those are showing up in the national unemployment numbers too, Colin. I mean, and the other thing that we should mention is whenever we talk about job growth or lack of jobs in the state, so Harriet already mentions the skills gap, it is important to note that the private sector is one thing. The public sector has actually been cut quite a bit here in Connecticut over the course of the last couple of years.
Yeah, that's sort of one of the ironies. One of the critiques of state government is it's too big, it's fat, in fact, Governor Malloy was pretty relentless, bordering on ruthless in reducing the size of the state workforce. So those jobs aren't there anymore. That is nominally, anyway, what a lot of people want. And you wonder whether it makes sense to decry the absence of those jobs when a job report comes out, because it's really what everybody claimed they were asking for.
I can answer that. It does make sense to decry that, because I'm going to anger Governor Malloy, but the fact is
he's not listening, Keith. I'm telling you right now, he's not listening.
He's there. Good morning, Governor. No, the problem is other states also contracted in the public sector, but still saw their overall jobs number, their blended number that had public and private combined, grow. That was the problem with Connecticut. Now, we can argue the size of the public sector, and that's fine, but it's still an important benchmark that we haven't hit, that our overall job count hasn't recovered to the level before the Great Recession. That, no matter how we try to dress that number up, is a big problem. And one last point, because I'm convinced UConn economist Fred Karstensen is listening, and I'm going to save us both a phone call.
He is listening. He's definitely listening.
As he likes to say
Fred.
many times, job growth is not economic growth. And even in 2011 and 2012 and 2013, when we were gaining jobs, the reason it didn't get a lot of headlines is because they weren't great paying jobs. We lost a lot of income. We saw a lot of architects and engineers replaced by folks in the retail sector who are making a lot less money. That's still another softness in our economic recovery that we've really never addressed.
I have to ask you, Keith, before we move on, to just take a quick look at what Donald Trump's federal budget might mean to the state. What are you hearing at the Capitol now? You get these bad economic numbers. Ned Lamont's trying to deal with his own budget. I mean, how exactly do you see the state grappling with this series of things coming up at this time, trying to obviously close a big budget deficit and also spur economic growth at a time in which it seems like things are softening and the whole country might be heading down that staircase toward recession? It's not just Connecticut.
Right. Two things stand out. A lot of people forget, as bad as the last recession was, we got hundreds of millions of dollars in federal stimulus money that I don't know that Connecticut is going to be seeing the next time around. Which is one of the reasons why I think Governor Lamont is really pushing to bolster the rainy day fund with the one-time items that the resources from the one-time items that Harriet mentioned. Everyone also seems to be saying, well, I'm convinced there's going to be a transportation bill, but it's not clear that that's an infrastructure bill. It's not clear that that's not going to come at the expense of other items. I think the federal government is still going to continue to retreat in areas like Medicaid. Connecticut's safety net is at such a delicate point. I'm sorry, I'm jumping the subject so quickly. We're talking about a $15 an hour minimum wage, but without a commitment to maintain Husky at a certain level. You could, for example, raise the minimum wage, push a bunch of families making about $31,000 a year off Husky, and then they're worse off for having the minimum wage. That's not an argument against the minimum wage hike, but we're almost at the point where every time you fix one problem, you create another.
And moving then
the federal government can make that worse.
Yeah, and that's really the point here, Harriet, is that Trump's budget has a lot of things in it. Obviously, cuts to the social safety net are well established, but then also, some boosts to the military spending, and of course, the military spending means, are we going to create more subs here? And so maybe people in parts of Connecticut, at least, are looking at the Trump budget and saying, not so great when it comes to cuts to the EPA or cuts to the social safety net, but hey, maybe we're going to build some more subs here.
Yeah, there was an interesting kind of schizophrenic response from the congressional delegation. Rosa DeLauro saying, never, it'll be a cold day in hell before I help pass this budget. And Joe Courtney's going, yay, 3 subs a year. But to be serious, that 3 subs was very interesting because Joe usually has his ear to the ground on what the Pentagon is going to do. He's been asking for that for a long time, and it really kind of came out of the blue. I don't believe he thought he was going to get that. So
it's perhaps because the Pentagon doesn't actually want or need those subs. Donald Trump wants them.
Well, who knows? Who knows what the machinations were behind the scenes? I think things are going to become a little clearer in coming months about where exactly that came from and whether does it. I mean, what we've always got to remember in discussing any administration's budget is it's going to go through the meat grinder, through Congress. So things will look a lot different at the end of it than they do at the beginning.
And it might be even more aggressive than a meat grinder, Colin. I don't think that an awful lot of the things that Donald Trump has put on the table are going to get through a democratically controlled House. Certainly, do you think that the Trump budget has any big impact here in our state?
Well, first of all, I mean, this is the budget that you would craft if your inaugural address was about American carnage, right? This is a budget where the only growth is in areas like defense and homeland security. Any way in which the federal government actually helps citizens is being bled out. I mean, really, the only growth is in sort of aggression, defense, paranoia. And so this is one of the problems with Connecticut. For a long time being yoked to a defense economy, you have John Larson, who's the congressman of fighter jets, and Joe Courtney, who's the congressman of submarines. But the reality is, like, what this budget does to Medicare, which is, I think, a much more pressing concern than whether or not we need 3 submarines for most of us anyway. I mean, we're already, have the world's largest defense budget by far, way ahead of any other country. I mean, I just hope that this budget, I hope it does go through the meat grinder, and I hope that what is restored to it is a vision of the federal government as a vehicle for helping our citizens, making our country a better place to live in, as opposed to enabling us to fight off real or imaginary enemies.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, Colin was just mentioning Medicare. Well, we're going to talk about whether or not the state is taking a look at a new way of thinking about public health care, maybe a public option coming back on the table. We're talking today with Colin McEnroe from The Colin McEnroe Show, Keith Phaneuf from the Connecticut Mirror, Harriet Jones from Connecticut Public Radio here in the Wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. Join our conversation at WNPR.org/The Wheelhouse. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. We're joined today by Harriet Jones, who's the managing editor for Connecticut Public Radio. Keith Phaneuf, who's the state budget reporter, a kind of Jedi Knight of state budget reporting. He reports for the Connecticut Mirror. And Colin McEnroe is here. And Colin's the host of the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR, of course. Colin, what's in your show today?
We're doing a show on a cultural phenomenon bordering on a cult, which I knew nothing about. This is just one of those things which has had a tremendous impact, but had passed me by completely. And that is the world of Marie Kondo, the guru of tidying up your life. And we will not have Marie Kondo on our show today because she doesn't really speak English. But we are going to have one of our consultants on and other people who've kind of looked at this whole world. I will just very quickly say that Betsy Kaplan, the producer of the show, made me go home and watch a bunch of Marie Kondo programs on Netflix. And I got all excited. I got really excited. And I took all of my T-shirts out of my drawer and I folded them the Marie Kondo way.
You did?
And then I put them back in the drawer and I took a picture of it and excitedly texted it to Betsy Kaplan. And she said, "That's not how you do it, stupid."
Were these the T-shirts that spark joy in you?
Yes, you have to, the T-shirts you're getting rid of, you have to thank them. Yeah, you have to say thank you for being my T-shirt.
We're gonna.
You're now going to become a rag, but thank you.
Fold things up on the Colin McEnroe Show this afternoon at 1:00. So, with all the uncertainty of the future of the Affordable Care Act, health insurance exchanges created under it, of course, there's a new push to expand government-run health care, not just at the state, but also amongst some at the federal level. So there's a new proposal unveiled at the state capitol last week. It would open state health plans to nonprofits and small companies, those with 50 or fewer employees, and form an advisory council to guide the development of a public option in Connecticut. Now, here's Matt Lesser. He's one of the main proponents. He's a state senator talking about why he's fighting for a public option.
Surviving cancer was tough enough as it is, but I am a state legislator, and I get great health care through the state. This bill is about making sure that other people out there can access the same health care that we get at state legislators.
All right, Keith Phaneuf, any hope for a public option?
Yes, but with all due respect to Senator Lesser, quotes like you just played are what leads to all the confusion. This does not mean people will be able to get the same level of health insurance plan that state employees get. That just means they could buy a lesser quality plan from the state of Connecticut.
See what you did there.
That's a huge difference. That's not even close.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make a sexy quote. And then, unfortunately, the folks who then say, why are we getting all this bad press about public option? Why do people overreact? Well, because you try to sell it as something more than it is. We're simply saying, is it possible that the state could get the insurance companies to provide something, that's a little more generous if the state uses its purchasing power to assemble this plan and it's looking to put together a pool of people, primarily nonprofits and small businesses who'd be able to buy the insurance through this. But the plan that they would actually get would still be basically what those small businesses and their employees could afford. The state just uses its leverage as a big purchaser of health care to get them a discount. I'm not saying that's not admirable. That's still a good program. It may not even be a large cost to the state of Connecticut. It's simply not the same health insurance that the public sector gets.
It sounds, Harriet, a bit like a watered-down version of some plans that we've heard about floated in the past.
Yeah, and this is interesting that this is now a space in which the states are trying to innovate because, of course, the floor has been ceded to them by Washington, D.C., which is in complete gridlock about healthcare of any kind. And so, healthcare still being a need that people have, the states are just starting to have these kind of more innovative ideas about how do we actually roll it out to more people. And you see, there are other states who are also trying to create public options in other ways. You see New Mexico and I think Colorado are looking, do we do Medicare expansion but even bigger? Do we basically allow people to, sorry, not Medicare, Medicaid.
Medicaid expansion.
Do we allow people to buy into Medicaid, if they want to? So different kind of ideas of different ways to skin this cat. And this is the way that Connecticut has come up with and this is an idea which has actually floated around for quite a few years. I think Kevin Lembo has been behind this idea for a while. And it's going to be interesting to see, is this the year when it can advance?
Colin?
Well, the greatest myth in all of this kind of conversation, and it is floated around all the time, is that private enterprise is streamlined and non-wasteful, and government is inherently wasteful. And that statement blows up every time the public option comes up, and the public option has been coming up for years. Obama would have liked to have had a public option in the Affordable Care Act, but he was also working very closely with insurance companies on doing the Affordable Care Act with them. And their reaction was, if there's a public option in there, we're screwed because everybody will take that instead of what we offer. So I tend to look at this and think, yeah, this is something that is certainly worth trying. I think the other part of a public option is, and we should emphasize, this is not Medicare for all. This is not a single payer health plan. This is simply the government saying, what if we just tried to collect enough money to insure people and didn't do anything else? Because, in fact, private enterprise invariably has a whole lot of other things that they're doing. What if all we tried to do was create a model where we had enough money so that we could insure the people who are in our plan, and that's it? And I think that is worth trying.
Think of it this way. If the John Dankosky Company, which we just made up here, I got to stop hitting this thing, this microphone. If the John Dankosky Company had 10 employees and they went to insurance company X and they tried to get a price with the money they had and you didn't like the looks of the plan for the money you could afford, the state then says, John, let me try the same thing. I buy a lot of insurance, but it's still working with about the same amount of money that you could bring to bear. And it's just trying to leverage a better price. And again, I'm not saying that won't have some success. It's nothing like single-payer healthcare system. Right. It's nothing close to that.
And I guess I'm just wondering how much you feel like at the Capitol right now that could be a possibility to get through during the session whenever any idea that is complex like this and large and comes at a time of other fiscal problems. It seems as though it gets put on the back burner at least through this year. Do you think it actually has a chance right now?
It would depend on it's got an uphill climb because of the perceptions about it. And like you just kind of hinted, if it doesn't come off the back burner soon enough, you're going to either do it early or you're not going to do it at all. If this thing lingers into the final week, the debate continues in 2020.
They are saying the seed money, they're claiming the seed money they need is $1 million or less, which
Correct.
surprised me. And, in the grand scheme of these things, is really not a lot of money to create a brand new insurance model. So, but I also agree that politically it's going to be tough just because this is going to be a tough session.
And I'm just wondering here what the business community at large thinks about a
Why do you
project
laugh,
like
Colin?
this. Yeah.
Well, it might be a little bit difficult to tell because the CBIA has come out strongly against this option, saying, well, what it doesn't do, it doesn't address health costs. In fact, it might address health costs in the way that Keith is saying, by leveraging the buying power of having many covered lives.
Do they still sell health insurance, Harriet?
You anticipated my point. So, there's a way in which you can't exactly call the CBIA, the pure voice of business on this because
disinterested third party.
One
Yes.
of the things that they do is that they sell insurance plans. So they would be a competitor of this public option. So
Not to mention there's not much. I mean, health costs are so much bigger. It's almost like saying, well, this plan doesn't address global warming. Nobody yet has gotten their arms around healthcare costs. So if you're saying that's your litmus test for going forward, I've got to be convinced you've contained healthcare costs. Well, good luck.
And the private model is all over the map on costs, too. I mean, it's not like they've really done anything to address costs.
Before we move on to our next topic, I just want to address a tweet we got here from Tim Spencer. And this goes back to the jobs numbers, Keith.
Okay.
And he says, Massachusetts and Rhode Island have also had significant downward revisions in their numbers. Please get some perspective on what's going on looking at other states. Enough self-loathing from our media.
Well, as I've always said, Connecticut is in the exact same boat as every other state, and it's a completely homogenous country.
You just winked at me. I don't think that you're being
That wink came over the radio.
I don't think we're being completely honest there. I'll just ask you to put a finer point on that. What's different about the conditions in Connecticut to our
Every other
college
state
Yes.
in the country has recovered all of the jobs it lost in the last recession. Connecticut has not, despite Colin's rah-rah, Malloyish outlook. It is significant that we have not.
Was that a wink, too?
No.
We're going to have to talk to Keith during the break. If you wink over the radio, people can't hear it. On Monday,
I hit the microphone. I could
the
hit my
legislature's Environment Committee heard testimony on bills to ban use on single-use plastic bags. Those who showed up to support also noted the need to fix the state's single-stream recycling program. This is something that a lot of people around the country are talking about, Colin. Either a tax on bags or a ban on plastic bags. This is not the first time we've heard this.
No, there's so much to say about this. I'll just pick a couple of things. First of all, if you travel very much, you go a lot of places where they have either banned plastic bags or make you buy a plastic bag anytime you want one in a store. Or, a lot of things have been done in a lot of other places besides the United States and people. And in the United States, I don't know if all of Puerto Rico has banned plastic bags. Vieques, I know, has. And people, they adjust. They figure it out. They figure out what to do with it. It's not going to be the end of the world. It's certainly worth doing. The thing that I want to just emphasize here is the kids from Canaan who came in to talk about this. I think you're going to see a worldwide movement. It's already happening at Davos. There was a young woman from Sweden, 16 years old, who came in and lectured to them about climate change. I think what you saw in Parkland, which was a really stirring grassroots movement by 16 and 17-year-old students who are tired of waiting for the establishment to fix the problem of guns in this country. You're going to see it on environment issues, too. You're going to see more and more activism among kids because this is a planet they're going to have to try to live in after we shuffle off to our cosmic reward, and they're quite aware of what a poor job of stewardship that we've been doing. So, yeah, I mean, there's other things to say, including the fact that single-stream recycling seems not to work anymore, but I'll yield my time.
Well, but it does come up, Harry, at this important time at which, because single-stream recycling, which is something that these kids that Colin are talking about, but also us. I mean, we've grown up with this idea that we can recycle, reuse, we can find ways to deal with our plastics problem. If indeed there's not a market for the plastics that we recycle, and therefore it just piles up in landfills just like all the rest of the stuff that we make, do we have any sort of way forward other than to start thinking about bans on stuff that's just going to be there for 1,000 years?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that reinforces the old idea that there is no such thing as a way, right? We know we can't just throw things in the garbage and they disappear. We thought we could throw them into the recycling and they, disappear or get a new life. But it turns out
made into a Patagonia fleece for us at some point.
or something, yes.
Yeah.
But it turns out, again, that's not the case, and it's very much subject to market conditions. And the market conditions for recycling right now are very, very hostile. So, it's another huge public policy challenge.
Given all the other things that people have to grapple with at the Capitol, Keith, how much are they talking about plastic bags right now?
I think plastic bags has got a very good chance to pass this year. And I will just add, this is why people who read the budget regularly are better than everyone else. And I am not winking at John right now as I say that.
The humility.
Because when you're looking at the budget, you try to trend things out down the line. If we do this, A causes B, B will then cause C, and you follow it through. You'll probably see if the plastic bags passes, people will adjust. But one way the supermarkets may very well adjust is they'll just bring back every store. Some still have the paper bag option. You'll see them bring that back, and they'll pay for it by raising the price of groceries. Some people have said if we raise the minimum wage, that'll have an effect on a lot of things, including the price of groceries. If you see tolls installed, then all of a sudden you may see, because Stop and Shop doesn't have a garden in the back, everything gets trucked in. We could be sitting here in a couple of years and saying, wow, what has created this strange dynamic of a huge surge in the price in groceries in Connecticut? We have a lot of items that can specifically play out as pushing up the price at the grocery store.
And meanwhile, just this week, we're sitting there sort of waiting for word on negotiations around thousands of Stop and Shop workers around New England who are, potentially going to go on strike. They've already voted for this, Harriet. As we talk about Stop and Shop, the price of groceries, the way in which groceries get delivered, not just paper or plastic, but the way in which all these thousands of people who work there are employed, that's up for debate this week as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, we saw this a few years ago too. This, threat of a strike at Stop and Shop has happened before. We've now seen all of the New England locals vote for strike authorization, which doesn't mean they're going to go on strike. It just means that if negotiations break down, they have that option and they can do it pretty quickly. I think there are negotiations today and tomorrow, but there have not been further negotiations days set after that. So, this could be an interesting week.
And just as much as people think about the old Stop and Shop as a local New England thing, it is actually
Dutch.
owned by a big Dutch
Ahold.
company,
Yeah.
Ahold.
Ahold. Yeah.
Yes. I just want to say quickly to fact check Colin, yes, indeed, Puerto Rico, along with Hawaii and American Samoa and California, have banned the use of single-use plastic bags already. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk briefly about a big college scandal that broke just this week and what it means for higher education across America. Harry Jones is here, managing editor for Connecticut Public Radio. Keith Faniff, the Obi-Wan Kenobi of the state budget from the Connecticut Mirror, and Colin McEnroe from the Colin McEnroe Show. This is The Wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. Join the conversation at WNPR.org/The Wheelhouse. Joined today by Keith Faniff from the Connecticut Mirror, Harriet Jones from Connecticut Public Radio, and Colin McEnroe from Connecticut Public Radio's Colin McEnroe Show. Really big, kind of crazy news coming out of Boston and other parts of the country this week. Just reading from WNPR's reporting on this, authorities in Boston announced charges Tuesday in an alleged large-scale college bribery scheme. Amongst the various people tied up in this, former Yale soccer coach Rudolph Rudy Meredith. Here's a quote. The head women's soccer coach at Yale, in exchange for $400,000, accepted an applicant as a recruit for the Yale women's team, despite knowing that applicant did not even play competitive soccer. The student was, in fact, admitted, and afterward, the student's family paid Singer $1.2 million for the service. William Singer is the founder of a college prep business called The Key, which is tied up in all this. Colin, there's so many details. There's specifically this Yale detail. But there's also this larger question about elite schools, who gets in, the rich versus the poor, and this is a big, ugly scandal that's going to pull in an awful lot of people from around New England and the country.
Yeah, John, this whole thing kind of takes me back to my own days as a member of the Yale women's fencing team. And my coach used to say, Colin, you're not a woman, and you usually are holding the sword by the wrong end. But thanks for the Volvo. Thank your parents. So, no, I mean, this
All those were a lot cheaper back then.
So, I mean, there's so many ways in which this is fascinating, including, of course, it's kind of an inversion on the usual college athletics scandal, which is that a highly skilled and talented athlete is given either a job where he has to turn the lights on or off once a week or something, if he remembers, or that he has some class he's taking that's not a real class where somebody else does the papers. This is the opposite. And in some cases, I mean, there's some hilarious instances. In one case, a kid was being listed as a football recruit despite having attended a high school that didn't have a football program. And the answer when this was brought up was that he'd been to some kickers camp or something. That's why. So, and so it is funny, but obviously it also should make people mad. And it's an extension of a system that's existed forever, the so-called legacy system, right? So rich old families with their roots in various universities have always been able to get perhaps less bright and talented members of their family into these schools. The next iteration of it was kind of the institutional development model. So Jared Kushner's family, I think, poured about $2.5 million into Harvard right around the time it was for time for Jared to matriculate. So that's like the next step, right? If you have a lot of money, if you have $2.5 million, you can make bequests that obviously will probably influence some decisions. This is sort of a smaller scale, right? Maybe you can do it. I think Felicity Huffman and her husband did it for $500,000, or maybe it was the woman from Full House. I don't know, for $500,000. But sometimes it's $15,000, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 if you find the right coach. But it should make people mad still, because it is taking a system that should be fair, should be run in the best possible way, because this is how you climb the ladder. This is how you go up the staircase that Keith was talking about before. It ought to be the best possible system it can be, and instead it's corroded.
In terms of people who might be angry about this, let me turn to managing editor Harriet Jones from Connecticut Public Radio. She's got a couple teenagers looking at colleges
yes,
right
I
now.
Do.
So, I mean, what does it say to you both as a public citizen and as a parent?
Well, I mean, I was feeling kind of between a shrug and my chin falling onto my chest yesterday about this story, because as Colin says, the system has never, ever been fair. Our legacy admits there's, you buy a building, you get your kid in. There's also, things like SAT prep. I mean, there's plenty of parents who can afford SAT prep, gets their kid a higher score by a fair, what's a fairer means, but there's many bright kids who can't afford that prep who don't get as high SAT scores. So there's the system in many levels is not fair. So you might as well just say, well, okay, here's another way it's not fair. But if you look at the details of the fraud, it really is quite astounding. I mean, they were having kids take SATs and having proctors correct them, is what I understand, in the examination room. I mean, that level of fraud is quite, kind of jaw-dropping. And the number of people they had to buy off to make that work, it's pretty amazing.
And Keith, it's just so interesting. So it's coming at a time when less than elite but still very expensive schools around our region are closing up shop because they can't get enough students actually going there. There's the whole question about public universities, places like UConn, and whether or not they're really made anymore for the people who pay taxes here in the University of Connecticut, home territory of Connecticut, and whether or not it's for foreign students from outside the state. So there are all these questions. There are questions at the federal level, people in Congress asking about, should college actually be free for anyone? And then this scandal gets dumped in the middle of all this.
And it wasn't that long ago the legislature in Connecticut was discussing, well, because we can't keep up with our payments to cities and towns because private colleges are tax exempt. Some people are saying, well, should we be allowing the city of New Haven, which needs the money, to tax Yale University? I was like, no, it's such a driver of economic growth. And I'm not saying it's not. I'm simply saying when you see a scandal like this, it just throws fuel on the fire. There are people who are saying, look, maybe Yale could actually afford to pay some property taxes.
Well, although we should note that Yale was not implicated in the actual in this investigation.
That's right. Their soccer coach is.
Yes,
the university
right.
has made clear that it's not. That having been said, go ahead, Harry.
Well, I just had another interesting thought about this is why did these people feel why was this so important to them? Because these are incredibly privileged kids anyway. They're going to, probably get far in life. Why is an Ivy League education so incredibly important to their parents that they would commit fraud to get them in? I think that's really, really interesting. And is it more to do with the parents' prestige than it is with the kid?
Parents' prestige, but also the connections that come with this, Colin. I mean,
but these
Ivy
are
League
kids with connections anyway.
Yeah,
Right.
To be fair, yes, you're right. Yeah.
I think another thing that's kind of troubling, and it kind of gets back to that notion of people having core values, is that in many cases, part of the narrative was that the kids weren't told what was happening. Although it seems to me if you're showing up as a kicker on a football team, you've never played football before, something should be bothering you a little bit. But supposedly, as many parents as could, insulated their children from knowledge of what was happening. And see, once again, I think this is the kind of thing that leads to a society where people are not even aware of moral choices being made. I mean, you've got a generation of parents who are very comfortable making an unethical choice, and they're insulating their children from even consideration of that choice. That can't be healthy.
Yeah, the ultimate helicopter parent is one that comes in a helicopter and just drops the kid off on the football field for the very first time. We've got to end the program, as we always do, with some feats of strength for this week, some things that you really liked to hear out of the week's news, or maybe a grievance or two. Harriet Jones, I'll go to you first. What do you got?
Well, actually, it sort of dovetails quite nicely with the last topic, because I was going to give a feat of strength shout out to all the high school kids who turned up at the legislature last week. This was a story that Ryan Lindsay covered for us, to argue that social studies curriculums in public schools should include African American and Latino studies. And these were just wonderful kids. Many of them came from New London High School, go Whalers, who, these are kids who are making moral choices about their futures and who are seeing problems in society, are thinking constructively of ways to address them, and who are willing to engage with the system to make those changes. So. That is
a very good feat of strength. Go kids, and there's some reporting on that on our website, WNPR.org. Keith, how about you?
The last time I wasn't ready, but I have been prepared now this time.
Oh, good.
I have
Okay.
a feat of strength that
Here we
goes
go.
out to West Hartford resident Bill Morgan, longtime chief of the Capitol Police Force from 1985 to 2006. Came to the legislature yesterday, told a very brave story about his struggles with compulsive gambling. He's now a recovery coach. He was speaking, asking the legislature to consider dedicating far more money from the gaming expansion that's being considered to help fight gambling addiction.
That's a really important voice, and I'm glad you brought that to our attention. Thank you, Keith, for that. So that's another good feat of strength. How about you, Colin? What do you got?
Well, John, Bobby Gentile, Bobby the cook, Gentile is getting out of prison. Again, Bobby's had a lot of problems with talking to FBI informants and getting kind of locked back up. But the reason that I bring him up is, of course, he is one of the people who is often named as a possible participant in the Isabella Gardner Museum art heist, which is still first of all, they've never recovered the paintings. And this includes a Vermeer. There's like 34 Vermeers in the world. They've never recovered those paintings. And it's still the largest art heist, I believe, in terms of dollar value in the history of art heists. So, but the feat of strength I want to give is to our friends up at BUR. I think you might have mentioned this in the past, John, but Last Scene, which is their incredible radio podcast documentary, they did it in conjunction with the Boston Globe, is so listenable. It doesn't really solve the mystery, but you meet a lot of really interesting people, including Bobby Gentile, and a lot of people named Bobby, too. There's a high number of people named Bobby. Bobby Gentile and Bobby Gorenti worked together maybe on disposing of some of these paintings. Or maybe not. Maybe neither one of them had anything to do with it. I don't want to get a call from Ryan McGuigan, who's Bobby Gentile's lawyer.
The podcast is called Last Scene, and it's hosted and reported by Kelly Horn, and it's really worthwhile, and it's such an interesting listen. I'm going to end with a grievance here. Russell Blair from the Hartford Courant says a proposed bill requiring the licensing of cats is opposed by animal advocacy groups and is being labeled by Republican opponents as a cat tax. The licensing fee for cats would be $15. This is another way to raise money at the state capitol. I will just say, as someone who previously had 2 cats, but within the last year adopted 2 new kittens. I've got a lot of cats. There are a lot of cat-related expenses already. A cat tax. I cannot put up with this.
I don't know. I have dogs, and I already pay a dog license.
He's not
John,
winking,
so,
people.
Yeah. Could we at least tax Andrew Lloyd Webber?
Harriet Jones, Keith Fan of Colin McEnroe. Thanks for joining us. here in the Wheelhouse.